Well, thank you for coming. It seems as if we have stole most of the audience, so that's very good. Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Judith Misrahi Barak. She is an associate professor at Paul Valéry University in Montpellier, France. She's researched and published widely on aspects of childhood and Caribbean literature and writings on Indo-Caribbean writers and Indo-Caribbean writers in the diaspora. Apart from that, Judith has been an outstanding organizer and promoter of works in the Caribbean and the diaspora. Recently, last year, she organized the 3 Guyanas conferences in Holland and France, as well as in this building here. So, a tremendous person this field.
Maybe we should skip the introduction.
It gives me great pleasure to be doing this.
So thank you very much to the organisers and for the very kind introductions from Pam. So this is going to sound a little different first, but I'm sure you'll find your feet again after a while. So bear with me at the beginning. And we have started late, so I suppose we can. Ovid, Petrarch, Seneca, but also Héloïse Annabella, Madame de Lafayette, la Marquise de Sélierre, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, or Richardson, Goethe, Virginia Woolf, or Jane Austen are not names I would have expected to use at the beginning of the paper entitled Postal Politics Across the Atlantic and Understanding World, delivered to specialist audience of Caribbean scholars. This is good. These names immediately bring in associations with antiquity, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th centuries, and their unavoidable connections with European Enlightenment and the privileged life of social, philosophical, and intellectual exchanges. Beyond their many differences, all these writers and thinkers have in common the practice of the epistolary genre, and through the letters they wrote, received, and responded to, be they fictional or real, quote-unquote, they elaborated their own thought and the way they wanted to construct their relations to the world, to themselves, and to their own work. The epistolary practice became a laboratory in which to explore thinking, writing, and relating. In many ways, it empowered the genesis of the invention of the self and of the interpersonal relation, be it through the exchange of real letters or the use of the letter as a literary device and an aesthetic mode. The use of the letter as a mode of communication and as a literary genre dominated the European stage in the 17th and 18th centuries. The boundaries between real letters and fictional letters are sometimes quite blurred, but in any case, what emerges is a republic of letters through which the construction of a cosmopolitan world was made possible. And it became the best possible translation of the self on the global stage, at least for the men and women of letters in all meanings of the term, and for the powerful. Yet, as we know, the construction of European nations and of enlightenment is inseparable from imperial conquest, forced transportation, indentureship, enslavement, etc., and multiple migrations. In fact, the very creation and use of postal services had everything to do with the creation or reinforcement of the cohesion of a country or of an empire. Just a few very ultra-quick reminders. 1477, postal services were created in France. Louis XI, more particularly, I checked on that because I didn't know. In England, Charles I, so 1635, Royal Mail. And so just like the railway overseas, it was an essential tool of the development of the British Empire, as you all know. But the state service had also been implemented to counter the imperial attempts at domination. In America, for instance, the Postal Service was created in 1775 to support the move towards emancipation from the British. Benjamin Franklin was the first Postmaster General until 1776. So it was the first transcolonial move granting oneself the means to communicate without having to go through the British centre. All along this history of the already global development of telecommunications, we know that On top of the wars of conquest and the slave trade, the construction of the British Empire was also the story of families and individuals who migrated to flee famine, caste oppression, wars, domestic violence, etc., and to make a better life for their families. Migrating did not necessarily mean severing all contacts. After having been the privilege of the men and women of letters and of the powerful, exchanging letters often became the only means of remaining in contact. Families who had remained at home wanted to hear from those who had left, possibly join them. The ones who had left wanted to write back, making their families guess at the person they had become or could have become, reinventing the self. Epistolary writing has become the object of the whole field of academic studies, particularly among French scholars, but not only. Over the past 30 years, scholars have been using letters exchanged between migrants and their families, interpreting them from a historical and sociological point of view, and gaining insights into the conditions of migration, of integration, of work and play, work and pay, but work and play as well, of social relations, political engagement or disengagement, of the preservation of the bond with a mother country or the destruction of that bond. And this is what I'm getting at, slowly but getting at. These letters are also fascinating to read from the point of view of the aspirations and emotions that are expressed, always from the angle of a very specific context. However, it is mostly the letters exchanged between migrants leaving Europe and going to the New World that have been the focus of attention. Mostly, I mean, some of the letters have been digitalized and etc. But not enough attention has been granted, to my mind, to the transcolonial epistolary exchanges between colonies. How do they question the certitudes we thought we had about the genre itself, of the epistolary genre? Addressees and addressers may well have been in a situation in which they would never see each other again. In many ways, whether it was sent and received and read and responded to. Something of which was, well, far from always being the case, the letter paradigm gives to understand something of the complexities of transcolonial migration. The bond, yes. Memory, most probably. The reaffirmed commitment, maybe, but not always. Migration has always meant physical severance, absolutely. It has sometimes also meant complete disengagement. The reasons being very diverse and never straightforward. The exchange of letters, or lack thereof, shows the complexity of the relationship. I have written elsewhere about the abundant use of letters in Caribbean contemporary fiction. I want here to have a look at the preceding stage, at the preconditions at the time of the colonial migrations, because it seems that the writer's desire to include letters in their fiction has been feeding on the historical letters exchanged or not between the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans, playing with and signifying on them. So one has to keep in mind that letters are exchanged in an asynchronous but generally reciprocal relationship and function as a presence beyond the absence, aiming at abolishing the distance in space and the separation in time, and remaining that quintessential diasporic artifact sent across land and water when bodies cannot meet in the same space and time. Having a look at the epistolary exchanges that happened during indentureship implies revisiting and revising some of the general ideas about the classic epistolary exchanges that I was alluding to at the beginning of the paper, that can be generally interpreted as reaffirming an interpersonal commitment and a collective bond. It may have been true in the European context of the Republic of Letters or of the emigration from Europe to the New World, but as regards the 1.5 million emigrants who boarded the ships to the Caribbean as indentured laborers, my hypothesis is that the epistolary device of engagement becomes in certain cases a device of disengagement. The history of the bond is also the history of the breaking of the bond, and the same device is used in both cases. The symmetrical and reciprocal conversations one finds so fascinating between the home country and the host country turn out to be asymmetrical and non-reciprocal. Sometimes it is the lack of reciprocity that is empowering, and I'm going back to the first paper about agency. In the case of the emigrants who boarded the ships in Calcutta and disembarked in Georgetown or Port of Spain, I mean, very restricted focus here. Historians and anthropologists have sometimes shunned these documents because they were not written by the immigrants themselves and are not in the original languages. Yet it is fascinating to focus on the gaps and lacunas in the archives and on these documents precisely as the translations they are in all meanings of the term. Not physically written by the immigrants themselves and not laid down in the original languages, these documents are still absolutely precious expressions, direct and indirect, of the Kalapani and of the political power that was overseeing the migrations. At both ends of the Kalapani, the protectors of immigrants complained about the lack of letters exchanged between Indian immigrants and their families back in India. The protectors of immigrants or immigrants in Calcutta and Port of Spain refer to the reports on the conditions of immigration written by Major Pitcher in 1882 and by Sir Pearson in 1883. So these are some of the slides in the Calcutta archives. So there are obvious reasons why there are so few letters exchanged. For instance, the so-called lack of education. So of course I don't know how much you can see, just
very clear.
Yeah, giving you ideas, and of course I have written some of it. So of course were mentioned the deficiencies of the postal services, the lack of education, etc. But both reports by Pitcher and Pearson were sent to the colonial administration, and suggestions were made to try and change the situation, hoping favorable reports on the conditions of immigration would encourage more immigrants to indenture themselves. Suggestions were also made by the protectors of immigrants to implement schemes that would make the collection and the transmission of letters and remittances easier. Except for specialists, it may be near impossible to picture the linguistic complications of the situation. Even if it was not only low castes that emigrated, the high rate of illiteracy among the immigrants and their relatives made it compulsory to resort to interpreters and translators before the immigration passes could be issued, and eventually any letters written. The importance of the interpreters surfaces obliquely in all the documents, and sometimes quite directly in the contracts they signed. So in fact, some of these. Or in the mentions, in fact, that were made of the difficult situations they found themselves in, sometimes when it was not clear under which administrative authority they were placed, and when they were stranded, unable to come back to India once their stint on board was over. It was then, up to the protectors of immigrants to write the letters on behalf of the immigrants. Yet it was not only because postal services did not function properly, or because immigrants and their families were illiterate, or because the words on paper did not match the emotions in the heart, that there was a shortage of letters exchanged. There are other reasons for the fact that, quote, the colonial immigrant is notoriously out of touch with his people at home in India, which was such a problem for the colonial administration of the time. Some of these reasons can be understood through the letters that were sent from India, received or not, in the Caribbean, read or not, responded to or not. Indeed, it is the families back in India who seemed desperate not to lose contact with their relatives, who had chosen to leave of their own accord, or who had been lured into migrating by the notorious Arcadians. The migration, be it the result of free will, of fraudulence or abduction, was not always known to the families, especially if the immigrant had fled a forced marriage, domestic violence, chronic debt, family feud, etc. Most of the letters that can be found in the archives were written by the families back in India, trying to reclaim the link with the ones that had left. Such attempts at reclaiming the ones who had left can have multiple goals: activate or reactivate memory, request to hear back a few months or a few years after migration, inquire whether the immigrant is still alive, plead for their repatriation. Sometimes the protector of immigrants translates such simple requests as the family request for a photograph, so that the immigrant can be recognized when he repatriates. So just a few examples. Most often the requests come from India: a father looking for his son, a mother for her son, a wife for her husband. Very few are actually looking for a daughter, a sister, or a wife. In a few cases, one can recompose the whole story, as many people have already done. The protector of immigrant becomes the interpreter, the scribe, and the messenger, for instance, for Tassaduq Hussein looking for his son, Ashaq Hussein. And so we can reconstruct and reimagine all these the stories, and I guess I would have to skip on some of this. Sometimes the requests emanate from the colony the emigrant went to, Trinidad for instance. One of the family members reaches out to the protector of immigrants to find the whereabouts of a relative. So there are different cases, and how much time I have? Just maybe five minutes.
Yes.
Yeah. So many letters are written in the hope that the passage back to India will be paid by the family, or that inheritance will be granted. Some of the stories, verification by the colonial authorities, this had to be done about some of the stories that were produced. And for instance, there is one story about checking on one of the immigrants who had become mad, quote unquote, and if so, whether he left any property to be handed over to his relatives. So quite a few cases like these. So many stories, all those stories that were spun also speak to the reinvention of the self. So when the immigrant did not answer for several years, postponed his repatriation several times, explained that he needed more time to settle his affairs, etc., one can understand the difficulties attached to repatriation. Of course, it was sometimes desired by the families, but not by the indentured laborer, and we have been talking about re-migration as well, and re-indenture previously. So the protector of immigrants was sometimes summoned to contribute to the search for the immigrant, even if it meant using force. For instance, in a few stories, this one for instance, and this is, one mother, for instance, requests the protector of immigrants to lock him up. Lock him up is what an exasperated mother asks the protector of immigrants to do with her son before he boards the ship. So other cases have to do with the name changes, and of course I don't have to tell you how crucial this is in the Indian context. So as letter unfolds upon letter, one is left with having to imagine the ghost language that is there and not there, with interpreting the official language, possibly translated many times over. One has to read between the lines and understand the desperation of the family that is expressed behind the words. It is only matched by the desperation of the indentured laborers, who did not always want to repatriate, even when they had the opportunity of doing so, to the point of possibly committing suicide. Such is the story of Ranfer, for instance, that can be imagined through one of the official letters written about him. It is thought that he committed suicide, and this is one of the final quotes, but again, so it is thought he committed suicide during the repatriation voyage, and the conclusion was drawn that he had jumped overboard. Many stories point to how badly the returnees wanted to go back to the Caribbean. They could be found in Metrobus, that area near Kudupur, where they desperately waited, in fact, for a ship to take them back. And of course, we can refer to many texts and articles and written previously by Brinsley, among many other renowned scholars. So these documents, and this will be my conclusion, these documents, as they have been interpreted, translated, and transcribed, are intuitive, imaginative, interpretive narratives, in the sense that the contemporary reader has to use intuition, imagination, and interpretation to approach them. But isn't it always the case with the archives? What I see is precisely the way intuition can unfold and develop these stories. I see the way these non-reciprocal exchanges revisit the traditional categories of the epistolary genre mentioned at the beginning of this paper. The materiality of the graphic space cannot exist in the same way, since the handwritten letters do not exist, as they were not written by the addressers themselves, but were interpreted, translated, and transcribed. Not all of them have been archived anyway. The ones that did reach their addressees are indeed transcriptions written on behalf of another. The letters are still a presence in the absence, but it has created a new imaginary space. The chain of communication has been radically altered, also because a traditional letter is rarely meant to be conceived by the addresser, interpreted or translated by the interpreter or translator, transcribed by a colonial representative, archived by the colonial services, and read by a contemporary reader, who is neither of the entities mentioned above, is not, and additionally to that, is not the intended reader and is yet again another interpreter. In so many ways, it disrupts the traditional mode of an exchange between two people willing to write and respond to each other. It becomes a collective enterprise, one that is polyphonic, in spite of appearances to the contrary, where interaction is more limited and more problematic than usual. Many interventions have been needed to reach the final stage of the letter sent across nations. Even if the letters are sent but not always received, sometimes received but not always responded to, for the reasons we have seen, it is a whole chorus of voices that can be heard, diasporic and transcolonial. The addresser may continue to write despite the lack of response, and accept to be confronted to the ghostly text of the addressee who does not respond, who cannot respond, chooses not to be reached, and not to respond. Beyond the disengagement, one can also see a form of agency. The epistolary device, traditionally chosen to maintain a bond, becomes a strategy of disengagement. The history of the bond is also the history of the breaking of the bond and of the creation of a new form of agency in a new place. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I think this is another indication of new frontiers that we're conquering, we're moving to in this field. If you don't mind, because we've got a limited amount of time, we just move on, and at the end we'll have about 20 minutes or so of questions. So keep your questions. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a young scholar, Dr. Sasha Orbach, who is a lecturer in the History Department at the University of Nottingham, specializing in legal culture and the history of race and immigration in London and the British Empire in the late 19th century. Sasha, it's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you very much for describing me as a young scholar,
yes.
Even though I turned 46 this year. So I'm still youngish. I'm still youngish. I'm definitely immature, if that counts. To get right into it, the study of indenture, I think we can roughly divide it into 3 waves. The first wave is the 1920s, the discovery of indenture as a historical subject, done by Persia Campbell's work. We don't really get a second wave until the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when you have the economic and social history of indenture being written by folks like Hugh Tinker and David Northrop, along with the Indian diaspora historians often working in situ. Where we find ourselves now, I think, is on the cusp of a third wave of indenture studies. And it's at this point that indenture studies is becoming a distinct subdisciplinary field with its own frameworks of interpretation, and through this process contributes substantively to the study of broader topics in history, post-colonial studies, and a host of other disciplines. Unfortunately, it seems to me that we are still mostly stuck in that second wave. Now, there's been moves to create distinctive frameworks of analysis separate from what was done in the second wave. And good to see Claire in the audience, because she's trying to do this, and a couple other people are trying to do this. One of the keys here is comparative work. So to see Reshad Durrahi's work is also very rewarding. But there is a lot more to be done. And in particular, the segregation of Indian indenture, Chinese indenture from other forms of labor, particularly Afro-Caribbean labor, inadvertently replicates the segregation of the colonial system itself. Now, in the broader work from which this paper is drawn, I hope to demonstrate why indenture is a uniquely revealing historical phenomenon and to develop a distinct analytical framework for its study. One that, for example, integrates the history of Indian indenture not only with Chinese indenture, but with other forms of labor itself. And also to widen its contribution to a number of broader histories: imperialism, colonial nationalism, the globalization of the labor market, and definitions of freedom and unfreedom, and question the category of freedom itself, which slavery studies has done, but indenture has not. Basically settled for coerced and unfree and just more or less left it at that. But today my focus will be on violence, race, and the colonial state. This paper, examining one particular instance of fatal violence in 1872 British Guiana, makes several interrelated arguments that speak to the role of violence in the history of imperialism and the state, and indenture as a unique lens to examine it. I argue that incidents of violent confrontation provided an opportunity for colonial authorities to reconcile liberalism, liberal individualism, and moral rule with regimes of governance and labor control that seemingly contradicted them. In the wake of violent confrontations, colonial administrators and judicial officials accomplished this in two ways. Firstly, by refocusing both official inquiries and public discussions around the violence of colonial subjects rather than violence against them, even when the latter far exceeded the former in severity, as was typically the case. And secondly, by asserting that these violent tendencies, though confined to a small number of influential malcontents, that's the liberal individualism, demanded that the state prioritize the forceful and even fatal preservation of public order over addressing alleged violations of the rights of crown subjects. Outbreaks of violent disorder were thus transformed through state processes and public discourse into affirmations of colonial authority and regimes of labor control. This process of reconstructing disorder and misrule as order and just governments took place in two important contexts: that of racial discourse on the one hand and the historical narrative of racial disorder on the other. In other words, the building of colonial rule around the necessity of violent repression was a cumulative process, with each successive repression taking its justification from previous ones and laying the foundation for future measures of equal or greater state violence. I should also add that in the process, it's undermining its own legitimacy. So the story of the end of indentured labor is actually the story of the end of the empire, but you gotta go to another paper for that. So this process was aided by the powerful role of violent incidents in constructing the official archive of empire, so it's really gratifying to hear Judith bring that up. Disorder and its violent repression generated a deep and lasting imprint in the historical record. This record, in turn, became the raw materials by which historians have examined the role of violence in the colonial context, leading us to believe that imperialism and colonialism were violent everywhere and all the time. It's a very historically inexact way of looking at violence and colonialism. With a few notable exceptions, however, Rani Abdulla's work on the prose of counterinsurgency being the most prominent, the process by which violence is translated into history by the operation of state as an archive maker has not been extensively examined, or not sufficiently examined, I should say. What one finds when one unpacks the process is that the aftermath of violent incidents was in fact a fraught and contested ground in which the state's self-justification could be challenged from a number of directions. In this record, the edifice of law and policing that both denied subjects' assertions of rights and was subsequently employed to suppress violent disorder emerges as itself a primary catalyst of determined resistance to colonial rule. So just as the use of violence is a cumulative evidence, the resistance to it is also cumulative, responding and gaining momentum from each repression. The state, the empires, the colonial administrators are delegitimizing their own rule every time that they kill someone. In sum, the causes, conduct, and consequences of colonial violence reveal not the strength of British colonial rule, but its many contradictions and weaknesses. State violence was intrinsic to imperialism, not simply because imperialism was intrinsically violent, but because the vicious cycle of demands for rights and justice by colonized subjects, their violent repression, and such episodes' subsequent enshrinement in both the archive and popular consciousness was foundational to the justification of imperial authority. This cycle, in turn, has become a central feature of the historical narrative of imperialism. By examining this process in a single incident, I think we can better understand how the basic categories of analysis involved, the state, rights, justice, violence, and race, were themselves constructed by the violent contact of the rulers with the misruled. So, on to the event itself. I won't go into a background about British Guiana, its historical context. I'll think some of you are familiar with it. After Mauritius, it is the largest single site of long-term indentured labor in the British Empire. The numbers will come to about 250,000 by the end of the 19th century. And the plantation where this takes place is in the Essequibo, which is the northern district of British Guiana. Now, on the eve of the killings, which I call the Devonshire Castle killings, among those who wielded political and economic authority in British Guiana, there were two prominent visions of the indenture system and Indian immigrants subject to it. Again, those of you who study indenture should be familiar with it. One is that this is a new form of slavery, it is absolutely unjust, it is immoral. And the other is that, no, this is a relatively good system, it's creating better labor conditions than there are in India, and this is free labor. But ingrained in both those ideas, when the critics speak against indentured labor, they often talk about the keen sense of injustice expressed by the part of laborers. And we see this across the indenture system, the grievance process, right? The grievances are pretty constant coming from the workers themselves. And a key critic in this case is George William Defoe, who is a colonial magistrate. He writes this fairly trenchant critique of the British colony system, which triggers a government investigation in 1871. The behavior of indentured laborers themselves on the Devonshire Castle plantation, both during and prior to that fatal day in September 1872, confirmed Defoe's assertion about this keen sense of injustice. As several witnesses testified during the course of the coroner's inquiry that followed the incident, the main complaint of the Indian indentured laborers was they were being denied the justice and rights to which they were entitled. Though from the published account of that inquiry, the correspondence between local officials and higher administrators, and the manner in which the incident was subsequently reported to the public in both British Guiana and Britain, one would hardly have known this. Instead, contrary to the evidence readily available to those composing the accounts for public and official consumption, the Devonshire Castle incident was portrayed as the first stage of a murderous, colony-wide rebellion, fomented by conspiring malcontents with no justification for their grievances, and barely averted by the valiant and timely intervention of local forces. Over time, this portrayal, constituted across a range of government correspondence and newspaper stories, became the official narrative of events. By such means, a workers' demonstration against what they claimed were illegal and immoral practices was reconstructed as a justification of the indenture system, a defense of the violent suppression by state forces, and a moral validation of murderous colonial rule. I won't go into the actual events themselves because we have a limited amount of time. Suffice to say that the basic narrative is that a group of several hundred indentured laborers march off the plantation. They're going to march to Georgetown to complain to the governor. They're intercepted by a magistrate named Henry Loughran, who says, I will give you free summonses to my Danielstown courtroom if you just go back to the estate. They go back to the estate. 2 days later, they show up at the courtroom, and Loughran has in the meantime summoned constables from all around the region, about 16 of them, and he's lined the gallery of the courtroom with them. And the leaders of the crowd of workers go in and they see this, and they leave. And the narrative that Loughran later gives is they never showed up. His interpreter, and you're right to say interpreters always play a key role in this, says, no, that's not what happened. I called to them, and they said, we are not going to get justice here. They have brought the soldiers here, we will get no justice. And Loughran goes ahead and tries the case anyway, which is actually a case against the overseers in the plantation for beating up these two laborers, and he finds the overseers innocent, of course, and sends them home. The workers return to the estate, and they align themselves across the plantation road, blockading entry, in what the magistrate will later describe as battle array, and he even suggests that there's settlers in the crowd. He reads the Riot Act, which is the typical move in these cases. Then he brings out a chair and sits there for an hour, because you have to wait an hour after you read the Riot Act. He orders his constables forward to address the ringleaders. There's an accidental discharge of a rifle, reportedly when one of the people in the crowd hits a rifle with a hockey stick. And then there's a fusillade, and 5 people are killed, and 4 more are wounded. And then you have to have a coroner's inquiry because it's a suspicious death. In concluding his testimony at the coroner's inquiry, the magistrate, Henry Loughran, was effusive in his descriptions of the constable's conduct. And he talks about their valor, and then really ends with the killer. I believe then, as I do now, that the firing of the rifle saved the lives not only of the few supporters of law and order that were present from immediate destruction. He's not talking about the laborers who were seeking justice, of course, he's talking about his constables. I further believe that if the coolies had overcome the police, the county of Essequibo would have become a scene of murder, rapine, and pillage. And the jurors, fully in accord, return a verdict of justifiable homicide. But for the discharge of the rifles, in their opinion, this is a quote from their opinion, the riot would have extended over the whole district. To which one might ask, what riot? There was a bunch of workers across the road. Where's the riot? This looks like a strike to me. Okay, so that's the story itself. But how is this reconstructed as a justification of colonial rule? Well, the result of this judicial process and the intense controversy that it generated among British officials revealed the ways in which a violent local conflict could resonate not only throughout the colony, but across the broader context of colonial governance and the public debates over race, labor, and violence in the empire. The direct involvement of the Secretary of State for the colonies, John Wodehouse, the first Earl of Kimberly, in the affair raised both the prominence of the incident and the stakes for all those involved. Kimberly, in a letter to the governor of the colony, Sir John Scott, asserted that the complaints of the Devonshire Castle laborers in fact had merit. And in his view, contrary to the assertions of the earlier Parliamentary Commission on Labor in British Guiana, which was completed in 1871, their grievances concerning work hours, underpayment, and contract violation were justifiable and deserved a strict and searching investigation. Most crucially in this correspondence between Kimberly, the Secretary of State, and Scott, the governor, Scott explicitly dismissed Loughran's assertion, repeated prominently in the coroner's inquiry and the newspaper reports, that the Devonshire Castle incident was the beginning of a widespread revolt. He says there's absolutely no evidence of collusion between the different plantation laborers. This was not an imminent rebellion. It was the governor of the colony himself saying this. This critically undermined the magistrate's public defense of his acts and those of the constables under his command. The justified, if regrettable, killing of 5 rioters and potential rebels in order to head off a murderous colony-wide rampage was one thing. Gunning down 5 fractious workers who had committed no crime beyond unlawful assembly was quite another. Ultimately, it was Kimberly's responsibility to summarize the events at Devonshire Castle for 10 Downing Street. This final crucial communication would set the tone for how those with the greatest investment in the orderly governance of Britain's empire would interpret what had happened in British Guiana. The discussion of the event came at a critical juncture in the development of indenture, the state's roles and obligations, and the implications for Britain's commitment to just rule and the guardianship of its subjects' rights. It coincided with a rising swell of criticism against indenture from the Caribbean to India, and with the expansion of the system itself into new regions of the British Empire, most particularly Southeast Asia, which I also read about in another context. Despite all absence of evidence, and regardless of his own decisive refutation earlier, Scott insisted that the potential for a colony-wide rebellion had indeed loomed over the events at Devonshire Castle. And this is the tale that Kimberly passed on to 10 Downing Street. There was, however, one last forum in which the actions of Loughran and his constables had to be judged, the court of public opinion. John Edward Jenkins, a liberal politician and author, brought the issue to the attention of metropolitan readers with a strident commentary published by the London Times in November of 1872. In his letter to the Times, Jenkins, who had also worked as a magistrate and author, he had represented the British Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in the 1871 Commission, so he was experienced in British Guiana. In his letter, Jenkins criticized the newspapers of British Guiana for printing only the planter side of the equation. The acrimonious public commentary that followed included letters from the co-owner of the Devonshire Castle, a man named Gordon, the secretary of the London-based West India Committee, J.H. Olson, the former British Guiana magistrate turned anti-slavery activist Joseph Beaumont, and another owner of a West India plantation, Alexander Crum Ewing, and the Times editorial staff. So it goes on for about 8 or 9 letters. Where these letters differed was in the historical context that each author employed to understand the Devonshire Castle killings. The latter profoundly shaped the moral dimensions of the former. For Jenkins, the appropriate context was Jamaican Governor John Edward Eyre's excessive and unjust response to racial discord in the Caribbean 10 years earlier, the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865. For Gordon, the plantation owner, the events at Devonshire Castle could only be understood as an incipient Indian rebellion and the attendant potential for mayhem. Beaumont, the former magistrate, insisted that the moral corrosiveness of an exploitative labor system and the inherent injustice of a society that lived by it was to blame. It was the antithesis of liberal principles. I should add that Gordon and several others explicitly reference the Indian Mutiny. Like, this is what it was. We're seeing this all over again. And even in the coroner's inquiry, people keep mentioning sepoys. Oh, one of them was a sepoy. The only person that's established as actually a former soldier is one of the constables, who is himself Indian. The Times, in a similar vein, offered the sharpest condemnation of the plantation indenture system, which they equated with tyranny and extortion, warning the planters that moral outrage in England could prompt precipitous abolition of the system and bring about their economic ruin. In the end, Jenkins himself, in the longest of the time's published commentaries, was able to reconcile the abuses of the system with the principles of just governance. The real problem lay with the planters, who obstructed the colonial office's attempts at reform and refused to acknowledge the failings of indenture. Were these to be addressed, as Downing Street had insisted in a dispatch to Governor Scott shortly before the Devonshire Castle killings, quote, "The immigration of coolies may be made fruitful of good," and here I will conclude. Such faith in the efficacy of reform would have been cold comfort to those shot dead on the road in Devonshire Castle. Regardless, what is most revealing in this case is not the violence inherent in the labor system or in imperialism more generally, both of which are a familiar, if contested, topic of historical study. Rather, two particular elements stand out in the Devonshire Castle incident. The first is the long historical shadow of 1857. In the official mind, the events of 1857 set the most compelling racial context, accompanying Indian immigrants and eclipsing other incidents that were more proximate structurally and geographically, such as the Guyanese slave rebellions of the pre-emancipation period, or geographically and temporally, such as the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865. 1857 dominated interpretations of workers' actions, serving as a constant reference point for justifying their violent suppression by the state. It guided not only the rationalization after the fact, but according to the testimony of the magistrate and constables and the overseers, it actually guided their behavior during the events themselves, or so they said. The second element worthy of particular note is how violence helped create the Colonial Archive itself, and through it to perpetuate the idea that violence was an aberrant byproduct of colonial governance rather than a core element. Violent encounters between rulers and misruled, and the legal bureaucratic processes they triggered created this rich archive of material that in turn served as the basis for official discourse and policy in the imperial context in subsequent elements. So 1857 builds into 1872, builds into the wave of both violence and violent suppression across the empire in the next 20 to 30 years. I should add, there is another big British Guyanese, several more big British Guyanese demonstrations. The most interesting one is the Roinville demonstration, which happens in 1923. And the narrative of how it is described matches almost exactly the narrative of the official archive of 1872. So I sometimes think when I finish this book, I'm just going to call it a tale of two riots. You can have 1872 on one hand and 1823 on the other. But I also talk about Malaysia and South Africa and Mauritius in between. So we'll see. The history of those on the sharp end of this process remained anchored in violence because violent incidents generated a disproportionately deep historical record and prominent public recognition. That's why we need to be so careful and precise about discussing violence in the colonial context. Hence the persistence of 1857 as the reference point, both for the plantation managers and the magistrates in 1872, and for understandings of Britain's historical relationship with India and Indians to this day.
Thank you, Sasha, for your fine presentation. Here again, manifestation of the new areas we're getting into in this field. Gives me, keep your questions for Sasha then. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a very young scholar, Bhavik Doshi, who is a graduate from the Institute of the Americas at the University of London. And here again, the research he's been doing is taking us into fascinating new areas. His work has included study of the Arya Samaj movement, the reformist movement in Suriname, and part of his comparative work brings to it a multidisciplinary approach, including history, anthropology, sociology. A big hand to this young scholar.
Thanks to the organisers and thank you to you all for coming to this panel. So indentureship was a labour system that we know that was deployed by colonial powers. It manipulated and extracted peoples from all across the world to these imperialist colonies. I'm just going to give you some stats just to kind of get it out there and get it in the open. So the abolition movement brought slavery to an end in Britain in 1834, while in the Netherlands it was in 1863. Now, as a result of this loss of labour, the indentureship labour system was brought in. in 1838 by the British, and the Dutch later introduced it in 35 years later in 1873. Now, between the period of 1838 and 1917, the British brought over this is quite a precise number, sorry, 238,960 Indians across the Gala Valley, whilst the Dutch, between 1873 and 1916, introduced 34,404 labourers. Now, as Madhvi Gala says, this was literally an imperial reallocation of labour. And so it's undeniable that indentureship was used as a tool of oppression and power for imperialists to further languish and profiting off these plantations that they'd built. And it had left legacies in Indians, as by its very nature, legacy is defined as something that is transmitted or received from an ancestor or predecessor or from the past. And in this paper, I'm focusing on referring to a legacy of the past, as it seeks to explore the post-colonial legacies left in both states from indentureship, rather than speaking of the legacies of through the scope of music, language, or generally culture, Indian culture. I will talk about the socio-political and how it existed and still, to some extent, still persists today. So in this paper, I focus on Guyana and Suriname, then British Guyana and then Dutch Guyana. And what I found in my research is that there hasn't been a comparison between these two indentured labour systems, not in one paper at least. And so I thought it'd be good to have a comparison that allows us to explain the implementation and practices of the system by the British and Dutch and how they actually treated Indians, and which is actually critical to the legacies that are formed. And for the most part, there are massive similarities, but it's actually the differences that we want to highlight. These differences are very nuanced. And essentially what I'm arguing is that these nuances are very much the point of origin for the socio-political developments that have occurred, as they've allowed these post-colonial legacies to be formed in Indians. As in Guyana, what I suggest is that there's been an elitist ideology which divides and rules the country, whilst in Suriname, there's apparently been a legacy of cultural pluralism, which allows them to fit into a larger society whilst keeping their own culture, and which is accepted by a wider society. And just as an additional note, which has been mentioned by the previous panelists, is that through this paper, although this paper focuses on Indians during the indentureship, there are also obviously many other groups involved. There are African Creoles, Javanese, Chinese, and so forth that existed alongside them. So the experiences here of Indians aren't necessarily in isolation from one another. Rather, they would have similar or knock-on effects through the policies and practices of indenture. So we'll get right into it and go to the British. The British obviously introduced the indentureship labour system to kind of maintain their economic pursuits. The indentured labourers first arrived in Guyana due to the Gladstone experiments, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And they arrived upon the Whitby arriving in Berbice and the Hesperus arriving in Demerara on the 5th of May 1938. And I will just go over what John Gladstone apparently promised, and quote-unquote promised attractive features of plantation life, promising light work, comfortable dwellings, an abundance of food, legal protection, free education, free medical care, and religious education, and I think most of us know that's not true. And the indenture agreement, just to kind of give you a brief understanding, was just a 5-year contract, which meant workers would work from sunrise to sunset, 7 to 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, being paid $2.50 a month. And but this 5-year contract, it would actually have another 5 years of industrial residence, in which the labourers would have to work in order to pay for their passage back to India. So what I'm trying to say is that at no point during this time of indentureship did the British ever seek to get involved with their labourers. There was no idea of cultural assimilation. They didn't want to offer any premise of social equality for their subordinates, which included the Indian indentured labourers. The British actually used draconian measures through legislation, judicial punishment, and armed force. An example of that is that once flogging was banned in British Guyana, the planters instead used the political clout to pass the Immigration Ordinance of 1864 and through the court policy, and that declared that employers must provide suitable houses, hospital accommodation, and medical attention for Indians, as well as receiving the same wage as African Creoles. But the Indian labourers also had to meet certain obligations, where they would be punished. For example, if an indentured Indian refused to attend daily roll call to work or do the work that was given to him, he was placed before a magistrate and faced a fine of $24 or up to 2 months in prison. On the other hand, the benefits that stated by this ordinance, the housing conditions were actually extremely poor, and if they had medical attention, it was actually very basic, or they actually didn't receive any. And also their homes were actually forcibly entered by planters who actually would force them to go to work, would search for stolen goods, or would make arrests without actually any legal basis, without any warrants. The other colonial policy that I want to talk about is education. This was also forced upon Indians as they introduced the compulsory ordinances 1876, which essentially is compulsory education for children. And although it seems like this could be offering Indians a way to develop and gain knowledge, in reality it's actually forcing Indians to adopt English. And this was a process that considerably de-Indianized Indians and actually assimilated this idea of elite culture. Education was just another tool that the British had to maintain the power of their plantocracy, and was the only reason why it was used, because their plantocracy was actually threatened by the Indians. And even for those the Indians who actually utilised education, they would actually be culturally alienated because, of course, they came from a plantation society. And they were also mocked by the British for trying to imitate this eliteness. And so what I'm trying to say here is that the British actually constantly ruled and regulated Indians' lives from the very minute that they had arrived. And although there was this apparent detachment from labourers, the British had inextricably imposed their culture, their norms, their values and ideologies of elitism on their subordinates. And of course, every imperial power is elitist, and we all know that, and that goes without saying. But it's the manner in which it's exuded, which makes up these nuances in the social political legacies that are left behind in Indian indentured labourers. And by ridiculing and ostracising Indians because of their so-called primitive and barbaric rituals, practices and values, and in essence their cultures, they effectively use cultural prohibition to somewhat, sorry, I lost my place. To somewhat plant the seeds of post-colonial discontentment found after indenture. And I just want to end on the British were saying, Root Noreen actually said the colonial government encouraged immigration and the establishment of settled East Indian communities, but hardly provided a positive environment for the development of a settled domestic life for them. Now what's interesting on the other side, on the Dutch, is that the British came to an agreement with the Dutch for the exploitation of British Indians. And in this, they allowed the Dutch to sign these labourers on 5-year contracts. But what was strange actually is that they allowed the Dutch, they said to the Dutch that you have to provide Indians with a return passage at the end of their indenture period. So after 5 years, rather than what the British done was 12 years to 10 years. And so on the 5th of June 1973, the first Indians arrived in Paramaribo aboard a Lalahorrick ship. Now academics have noted the experiences of indentured labourers in Suriname differ from that of Guyana. So, for example, plantation owners actually allowed them a greater amount of freedom after hours to preserve their own customs. They also, in addition, they maintained regular contact with fellow labourers on plantations nearby, as well as having the space to meet friends. Ransford and Bloomberg actually provide a more detailed account, and they say that the regular shipping of labourers to Suriname provided an enduring bond to motherland India. The Dutch colonial government's attitude to indentured labourers wasn't as conducive to the fast absorption of the labourers, so the labourers could actually distinguish themselves amongst the different groups in society through their language and culture. There was also the prospect of returning back to India after 5 years didn't really stimulate the indentured labourers to actually settle in the environment culturally or linguistically. And a feature that's noted was that the Indians would be liable to Dutch laws, in which they must assign a protector of immigrants. The British assumed that this would be their British consul to Suriname, but actually the Dutch created their own agent general, and he turned out to be much better. His name was Johan Couture, and he would supervise labourers to see to their every need. In doing so, he actually improved medical care and living conditions for the incoming indentured labourers. And there is the argument also that James Cosbury, the agent general of British Guyana, also did a lot to help Indians, but that was far after when indentureship was. He didn't come in when indentureship first started, essentially. He came in 1880, he died in 1880, but so there was a time where abuses that had occurred, there was no kind of rectification of it. And originally there were no policies by the Dutch on assimilation, and this was mainly due to the fact that the Dutch again didn't know whether these Indians were temporary or permanent residents. But what they did do is actually they introduced education, not as a means to control, or so they say. It's more of a way to, what they tried to do is actually stimulate attendance at school by introducing what they call coolie schools. So the coolie schools were first being in the Marienburg plantation in 1890, where a teacher, Ahmed Hossain, taught in Hindi and Urdu. This is quite critical if you compare it to the British experience, because the Dutch actually allowed the Indians some allowance of cultural retention. But as 2/3 of Indians stayed in Suriname after the indenture contract had ended, the Dutch adopted a policy of a colonial policy of assimilation. And these schools were abolished, and the teaching instruction changed to Dutch, and they sought to impose this Dutch culture on all aspects of life for Indians. But it was almost done somewhat delicately. In this sense, Indians were able to utilize the areas of where Dutchification had occurred, such as in education, and use that as a tool of progression, while simultaneously having the awareness of retaining their own culture and heritage. As Beers-Naipaul said, the Dutch have offered assimilation but not made it obligatory. Their tolerance and understanding is much greater than that of the British. Now, the differences highlighted here are that of the ideologies, elitism and assimilation. They're constantly been repeated through different policies and practices during the indentureship period, and it has directly impacted the legacies that are left behind in the Indians that exist today. So the social political legacies that I want to talk about post-indentureship are actually in relation to the complexity of pluralism, plurality and pluralism. So we already know that there was ethnic tension when the Indians first arrived, as it was a common feature that Indians actually undercut the African Creoles as a labour force when they arrived on the plantations and when they were transported over. And for most Caribbean colonies in Guyana and Suriname, the colonial extractive and exploitative industries actually provided this impetus for nationalist politics to develop. And in both contexts, in Suriname and Guyana, Indians were seen to carry these legacies forward with them to help them shape and develop their socio-political spheres. Now, in Suriname, the governor of Suriname at the time, in 1933 and 1944, J.C. Kelstra, he actually undid a lot of the work that was done before of this idea of assimilation. He actually decided to implement segregation policies because he thought that would boost the colonial plantation economy. And he actually sought to Indianize Suriname. By Indianize, I mean he sought to implement policies that were used in Dutch East India. However, when we say segregational policies, it was actually he favoured Indians and Javanese in this case. He thought that they were actually able to build on the plantation. So really, the Indians were able to benefit from the changes in law, and this assimilation policy didn't actually drastically change too much. So the legacy, actually, what I found what the legacy was that idea of consociation. This is the idea of sharing power between different groups. Now the journey is quite simple from the indenture period. For the most part, the Dutch allowed Indians as well as other ethnic groups to keep to themselves and maintain their own culture, so long as they were able to contribute to Surinamese economy, and which they all did. At the previous process, Indians became attached to Surinamese society, and this allowed actually for the creation of what is an ideology that is still reverberated in Suriname. It's called unity and diversity, whereby allowing for the mutual respect of different cultures with no one tradition attempting to promote cultural hegemony. This is an ideology that's been the basis of Surinamese politics. Two big politicians, Jogaman Lachman and Johan Anglo, who are both the representatives of the Indian and Creole parties in Suriname. They came together in unity in order to celebrate, in order to bridge together all the ethnic groups. And it's a way of essentially celebrating diversity and equality without necessarily having to sacrifice one culture for another. And this was essentially the cultural pluralism that existed, as the Dutch somewhat unintentionally created this basis for ethnic pluriformity. Now, while in Guyana, this elitist ideology allowed for each subordinate group to have a sense of superiority, and actually allow for the foundation of ethnic tension between African Creoles and Indians. The Moyne Commission began in 1938 and actually set out to investigate the issues and the socio-economic conditions that exist in the British Caribbean. But as World War II broke out, this was delayed, and actually the rejection of assimilation from the British allowed Indians to have their own pocket of space in society. To themselves, as Jock Campbell, a plantation estate owner, evoked, oh, the coolies, they're not really part of the society at all. The indenture system ended less than 20 years ago. The coolies have their own language, religion, culture, and customs, superimposed on the mud of the British government. You don't have to worry about them. And this is exactly the case, as Indians had no interest in society and the politics that existed in then British government at the time. But by that very standard, by not engaging with other groups, allowed that elitist ideology to become ingrained and internalized. We see Chedi Jagan in 1950 brought together the African Creole and Indian communities in the PPP when it first started, but this was very short-lived. This force created the PNC. And both at the time were differentiated by ideological lines, the PPP being Marxist and the PNC being moderate. But soon after, they aligned by ethnic groups, the former being Indian and the latter being African. And the difficulties endured during difficulties endured trying to establish cultural pluralism are perfectly summed up by Brooke Williams, who essentially states that this is Anglo-European hegemonic dominance in a country that allowed for the formation of this idea, this culture of dominance. This elitism had been allowed to sunk in, and it persisted due to what she coined as the ghost of Anglo-European hegemony, whereby the colonial power, this is the British, no longer existed. They were essentially a ghost, but yet their influence persisted in the social political legacy that was left behind. Now, a point that I just want to make on my own kind of research that I found with Indo-Guyanese and Indo-Surinamese is that there was discontentment of the Indo-Guyanese I met in their politics and their society, and almost a sense of jealousy over the Indo-Surinamese, over their politics and society as in Suriname it's deemed as peaceful and harmonious. And I recall two actual vivid encounters first in Suriname from a Guyanese taxi driver who told me, I left Guyana, it was very dangerous. I would much rather be Surinamese where all the people are friendly and get along. And even among the Indo-Guyanese I met in this country, in Brixton at the Caribbean Hindu Cultural Centre, there was an acknowledgement of the violence that marred the country, as well as the resentment in some instances of the ethnic group. And they looked at Suriname as almost this perfect model that they should have replicated. And in contrast, the Indians in Suriname that I met were actually proud of their social political formations. The fact that they created a mamio, which is Nanandongo for the patchwork quilt of different ethnicities. And they looked together with almost some pity and sympathy, citing the violence, but offering no substantive reasoning as to why it exists. And I'm not saying that indenture is the defining reason for why these people feel these sentiments 100 years on from the abolition of the system, but rather stating it's important to acknowledge that this should be the frame of reference for the social political developments that have occurred in Indians in both countries. So just to conclude, the papers detail the aspects of implementation, policies and practices of the indentured labour system, or what briefly in Guyana and Suriname, and the ways in which the system was utilised in the treatment of Indians by the British and the Dutch has played a role in shaping the social political legacies that have manifested in Indians in both countries. And to some degree, it still exists today. And the British intentionally propagated this elite status, but without actually realising or fully comprehending that this ideology would actually spill over and affect Indians. And the Dutch unintentionally gave the impetus for cultural pluralism, in which diversity was acknowledged in Indians and it was celebrated. And I don't mean to say that Indians in Suriname have developed better than Indians in Ghana, because that is simply not the case. We can have a conversation after about the politics in Suriname. But realistically, if anything, indentureship was actually just another means to control the lives of servants, the economic, the social, the political, the cultural, and the environment. And for all the different approaches to colonial governance that I've kind of outlined, whether it's harsh or soft imperial power still have dictated the lives of indentured Indian labourers no matter what. And just as a final point, it's rather like I focused on the nuances because it allows us to magnify on both countries, as we're able to see the nuances actually provide us with a frame of reference where the post-colonial legacies originate from. In the Indians in Suriname and Guyana both had had experiences and encounters which actually defined them separately from one another, and that is how these social political legacies of elitism and assimilation have worked in being repeated in the lives of Indians. Repeated and reinterpreted in the lives of Indians since indenture. And that's it. I'm sorry, it was a